Welcome. And today, I have the honor of having the authors and researchers of their latest book, Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, The Pascagoula Alien Abduction, Philip Mantle and Dr. Irene Scott. The date was October 11th, 1973. The location was the Pascagoula River, Mississippi. Two shipyard workers, Charles Hickson, age 42 at the time, and Calvin Parker, age 18, decided to go fishing on the river after work. Both anglers were not having much luck that night, and they thought about calling it a night when something happened that would change their lives forever. A dazzling blue light from behind them illuminated the entire scene. Turning round, both men watched in awe as a ruby ball-shaped object descended. A door opened and three bizarre-looking humanoid entities glided out across to the two terrified onlookers. Both Parker and Hickson later that night made their way to the local sheriff's department to tell them that they had been abducted by aliens. It wasn't long before the story found its way into the hands of the media, and the story went around the world. Charles Hickson readily told his story, but Calvin Parker wanted simply to be left alone. Hickson co-authored a book with William Mendez in 1983, and it wasn't until 2018 that Calvin Parker finally told his story in full for the first time. Now, Philip Mantle is a veteran UFO researcher, author, and publisher in the UK, and was formerly the director of the investigations for the British UFO Research Association. He is the founder of Flying Disc Press. Now, Dr. Irene Scott, received her PhD from the University of Missouri in physiology, did postdoctoral research at Cornell University. She served on the Mutual UFO Network Board of Directors from 1993 until 2000, is a MUFON consultant in physiology and astronomy, and a wonderful field investigator. Now, this is their story. This is how they put it together. And enjoy. Hi, this is Lori Rayfeld with God, Aliens, and a Cup of Coffee. And today our guests are Philip Mantle and also Dr. Irene Scott. Explain how this whole UFO, first of all, how the events unfolded, and then how you got involved with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember reading about Calvin's encounter along with Charles Hickson back in the 80s, so it always fascinated me. And in 2015, I set up my own little business called Flying Disc Press. It's published UFO books primarily. And one of the books that I managed to get my hands on was one that was written by Charles Hickson and William Mendez back in 1983, and it called UFO Contact at Pascagoula. And you could buy the occasional copy online, but they were going for silly prices. So I bought a copy reluctantly. I paid the money for it. And I thought, well, I'd like to reprint this. I think it's ridiculous that people have to pay these prices to get a hold of this book. So it took me a while to figure out who owned the rights to it, even if anyone, but I did. We came to an arrangement. I had to rewrite the book because I just had the physical book in front of me, nothing else. And now Charles Hickson passed away in 2011. He's one of the two men that were involved. But I thought Calvin Parker, the other one involved, might still be alive. So I set out to find him. I did in 2018. The basic story of what happened is in 1973, Calvin lived out in Laurel, Mississippi, so not in Pascagoula at all. Their families, him and Charles Hickson's families, had grown up with each other. Calvin was 18, Charles Hickson was 42. Calvin had just got engaged to his childhood sweetheart, Waynette, planning to get married in November, but he was working long hours. She didn't see much of him. So it was Calvin's father said, why don't you ring Charlie Hickson? He's a foreman in the shipyard over there. Might be able to get you a job there. So Calvin did. Charlie said, yeah, no problem. The idea was Calvin would go to Pascagoula and board there with Charlie Monday to Friday, work in the shipyard, and then go home on a weekend. So he bought a new car, He sets off. So October the 11th, 1973, Calvin and Charlie went to work. It was Calvin's first day working in the shipyard. They went through the health and safety regulations in the morning, and then in the afternoon he was, at work. He was a welder. He enjoyed physical manual work. He drives them home at night. As they're driving home, Charlie says, you fancy going fishing tonight? And it was one interest that both guys had, despite their age differences. So Calvin said, that'd be great. Calvin didn't know the area at all. He lived a couple of 100 miles away. So they got some tackle, some, rods and reels and whatever from Charlie's house. They set off, bought some bait on the way. Charlie's giving Calvin the directions. Now, where they went fishing, Laurie, is not an out-of-the-way Mississippi swamp. It's right next to Highway 90. There's a huge toll bridge goes right over the river. The ships and boats coming and going. So as they're pulling into where they're going to park, they even pass a car that's already parked there. That has a young couple, having a kiss and a cuddle. They park the car up. They go to one fishing spot, but it's no good. It's infested by insects, flies. So they move to an old pier that belonged to an old shipyard that had long since, closed down. So they park themselves on the end of this pier, start fishing. But they passed the no entry sign on the way in, and Calvin commented on that. Charlie says, don't take any notice of it, So they start fishing, and then they hear this little zipping noise to begin with. And then these blue lights appear from behind them. They go out across the water. Calvin thinks, we shouldn't have ignored that no entry sign. It's the police. We're going to spend the night in jail for trespassing, They turn around. Of course, it's not the police. There is a large oval-shaped object descending. It's got two lights on one end. It stops just a couple of feet above the ground. It's giving off this intense light. An opening appears almost out of nowhere. And more light comes out of that, and it hurts their eyes. They have to shield their eyes. And from this opening, these three creatures literally appear, three humanoid creatures. Again, they don't touch the floor. They float over the floor towards them, over the ground. They describe them as being humanoid, but with a head, no neck. They had pointed protrusions out of the side and one out of the front. They had long arms with a pincer or mitten type appendages. Their legs were just stuck together. The legs didn't move at all. Their skin was grey, but it was wrinkled. They described it as looking like an elephant's skin. Both guys were absolutely terrified at this sight. Two of these creatures got hold of Charlie Hickson. One got hold of Calvin Parker. They instantly felt the fear leave them, as if they'd been given some kind of injection or drug or whatever. They were totally paralyzed. The only thing they could move was their eyes. They were taken through this opening. Charlie went to the right, Calvin to the left. Calvin says he was placed on a transparent table at an angle. He couldn't move. Again, he could only move his eyes. This big, ugly creature, as he described it, was kind of stood to attention next to him. This thing appeared from above, as if it came out of the ceiling, about the size of a pack of cards. It stopped, went all around him, making this clicking noise, and then was gone again. Calvin felt a presence behind him, and this other being appeared, and it was a woman. She looked pretty much human, Laurie, apart from middle fingers were very long. And she opened Calvin's mouth and put a middle finger in and touched the back of his nasal cavity, which hurt him. his lower clothing and his shoes and socks were removed. He says they stuck something in his foot and it hurt. And he felt as if he was having the life drained out of him almost. He was redressed. He managed to regain some movement and got hold of this female, but she pointed to the other creature and got hold of Calvin, and it was back out on the pier. Charlie reported something similar. He said he was suspended. He didn't say anything about a tail. He was just suspended. And this object came out of the wall. It was like a big eye. He felt as if it was scanning him or something. He never saw any female creature. He was absolutely terrified. And he was then taken back out, placed on the pier, and Calvin was literally stood on the pier with his arms out like that, facing the water. And Charlie got hold of him and shook him. Are you all right, son? Are you all right? And when they both turned around, they saw this object, gone in a flash. They were both traumatized. Calvin more than Charlie. Charlie had served in the army and he'd fought in Korea, and so he'd been under fire. So he'd experienced trauma before, as Calvin never had. Their initial reaction, Laurie, was, we're not going to tell anybody. They'll think we're absolutely bonkers. So they staggered back to Calvin's car, which was a brand new car, as I mentioned, brand spanking new. As they got to the passenger door, all the glass fell out. Calvin got in the driver's side to drive it off. It took him, he said, at least 20 attempts for it to start it. Managed to get it going. And as they're driving along, intending to go home, it was Charlie who had a change of heart. He said, we've got to tell somebody. What if these things come back and do this to somebody else? What if it's an invasion? So Calvin very reluctantly agrees. He's thinking, if this story gets out, I'm not going to be allowed to marry Waynette. Her father will think I'm crazy. So he agrees on one condition, that he will say, I saw the UFO, I saw the creatures, and that's it. I'm not going to tell him anymore. I'll say I passed out. And Charlie says, okay, I'll do all the talking. So they pull in at a little convenience store that's got a payphone. No mobile phones in 1973.
Right.
First of all, they ring the Air Force base at Keesler, which is just outside of the town. A lady answers it and she said, we're not in the UFO business anymore. Ring your local authorities. So they do. They ring the police. They arrange to meet them. They send a squad car out. First thing they do is give them a sobriety check. They're okay. They then escort them into town, where they go to Jackson County Sheriff's Department under the leadership of Sheriff Fred Diamond. Both Charlie and Calvin are interviewed separately. And to be honest, Sheriff Diamond and his deputies didn't believe them. This is crazy. So what they decided to do, Lonnie, they put them both together in a room. And there was a desk next to them. And they left them. I'm just going to go a cup of coffee, gents. We'll be back shortly. Unbeknown to Charlie and Calvin, there is a tape recorder playing in the desk. The deputy comes back, takes the tape, goes back to see his colleagues, and we'll have them now. They'll be laughing and joking while we weren't there. But of course, when they play the tape back, they're not. Calvin is literally crawling up the walls. They're recounting what happened to them. So law enforcement then kind of changed their opinion. They tended to, something's happened to these two fellas. They're both scared out of their wits. So they say, you can go home. There's nothing we can do. So they say, whatever you do, Sheriff, please don't tell anybody. And they say, no, we won't. So the next morning, Charlie and Calvin get up to go to work. It's Friday morning. Calvin drives to the shipyard. They notice there's a few more cars than normal. But as they're going in the gate, the gateman says, boss wants to see you. So they literally park the car, go see the boss. And he said, what the hell have you two been up to? The phones won't stop ringing. We've got journalists outside. So they tell the boss what's happened. He offers them the assistance there and then of his lawyer, the company lawyer if they need it. They're then sent to the Singing River Hospital for an exam, and they're okay. Somebody, we're not sure who, mentions radiation. Well, the hospital says, we can't check for that. But guess who can? Keesler Air Force Base, the one that they'd rung the night before and they told them to get lost. So they are driven out to Keesler Air Force Base. They run a Geiger counter over them. There's no sign of anything. But they say, while you're here, gentlemen, why don't you tell us what's happened? So they do. That was recorded, but not on a tape this time, Laurie. It was a stenographer. And so there is a full transcript of the whole conversation they had at Keesler. The following day, Dr. James Harder and Dr. J. Allen Hynek himself arrive on scene and talk to both guys. They listen to the secret tape, which Charlie and Calvin are still unaware of, speak to others. And the following day, Hynek holds a press conference and says, these gentlemen are authentic. Please treat them with respect. Calvin is severely traumatized by this. He goes back home. He ends up in hospital, but he gets married in November as planned. Charlie becomes the focal point. He speaks to the media. He goes on television. Down the years, he speaks at UFO conferences. Occasionally, Calvin would appear, usually at Charlie's insistence. I don't know if anyone listening or yourself, Laurie, will remember the TV series in the 1980s, The Hulk.
Yes.
Dr. Banner was the Hulk, and there was a journalist hunting them. And every time the journalist almost caught them, he'd pack his bags, move on to the next town. Well, Calvin did that exactly in real life with his wife and family. And, he even, at one point, he even used a false name. And he was working for a gentleman, and his boss called him in and he said, your name and your social security number don't match. So he got fired for that, and it severely traumatized him. And like I said, I got permission all these years later. Calvin had never told his story in full. Charlie died in 2011. And I managed to track Calvin down to get an interview. That's all we wanted. And I thought, I'll republish Charlie's old book and I'll put an interview with Calvin in the back, bring it up to date. Unbeknown to me, Calvin had been talking to his wife, Wynette, about the possibility of writing his story. And he mentioned it to me, and I said, well, look, he still had he was very suspicious of any journalist even then. This is 2017, 2018. I said, well, if you write it yourself, Calvin, there's nobody can change the story, can there? And I said, that's the only way you can guarantee it being 100% accurate. So he said, you're right. And he agreed to write a book on the condition that I don't alter any one word of it without his permission. Even if it's spelt wrong, I wasn't allowed to change it, because he said, I want people to know me, me, the person, as well as what happened to us. So we wrote the book. Calvin did. It was called Pascagoula, The Closest Encounter. It came out in 2018, did very well. And that's how it all began, Laurie. And, and Calvin told his story in full for the first time.
That's incredible. I just, I find it really interesting how it parallels so many other events that have happened to other people. And I'm curious as to why the police or the members at Keesler Air Force Base, did any of them go out to that pier?
Not that we're aware of. We have photographs of the location, and there is nothing there. It was as Calvin described it, it was a very scruffy place at the time. There was lots. It's where people would dump the trash, basically. And also that area also used to get flooded a lot downstream and end up, up on the shore. And Calvin remarked on that, it looked like people have been dumping their stuff. So some of it was washed up during the floods on the river. But what we did find when the story got out, we had a couple of people. We had a young man called Mr. Caldwell. He was only about 11 years old at the time, back in 1973. And this thing went on the television, Laurie. It was in all the newspapers, on the radio. And it happened on a Thursday. So Friday it hit the newsstands. This is Saturday morning, and young Mr. Caldwell, 11 years old, he says, on a Saturday morning, my mother and father used to have a sleep in, and I was allowed to sit and watch cartoons on the TV. But this Saturday morning, of course, they're asleep, and he's heard about the UFO, and he knows the location, so he goes outside, gets his bicycle, calls on a couple of friends, and they pedal to this location. And right next to where it happened, literally right next to it, they have this grass that grows 6-7 feet tall. And these three young lads pushed their way through this vegetation. And he says, all of a sudden, we came upon a clearing in the vegetation. Well, it was simply gone. There was nothing left of it. It wasn't flattened. It was just not there. There was no sign of it. And we also had another chap by the same name called Caldwell, but not related. He was about 14 at the time, and he was in a car driving over the bridge, over the river. And he said, I looked down, and he said, part of this vegetation is missing, But the police didn't do anything. I mean, the next day they were literally besieged, so they didn't have an awful lot of chance, perhaps. In small town police force or sheriff's department, I don't think there was a lot of them. For example, the day after, October the 12th, we have a recording of a radio interview with the sheriff. The journalist has gone to the sheriff's department trying to find Charlie and Calvin. Well, they're actually at the hospital. So I've got to get an interview with somebody. Oh, there's the sheriff. And he interviews Sheriff Fred Diamond, and we have that recording, we transcribed it and put it in the book so everybody can read it, And one of the deputies, Deputy Glenn Ryder, many times down the years have gone on the record and said, look, if these two guys were acting, they ought to be in Hollywood because they'd win an Oscar. He says, especially the young one, Calvin Parker. He was terrified, Oh,
that's incredible. So when you both started investigating this story and having to go back to think that 1973 is almost 50 years. I mean, October 11th, 1973, yep. We're coming up to in a few days, it's going to be 50 years. Yep. How difficult was it for you to find other maybe witnesses or people who've heard little even tidbits to just
Yeah. I think we're very fortunate. What happened? Calvin made a little mini documentary, about 8 minutes, with a local journalist and a lady called Karen Nelson, and this eventually made its way onto YouTube. And there's lots of comments underneath it. Calvin's retelling the story, goes to the location. And one of the comments was, my mum and dad were on the opposite side of the river that night, and they too saw the UFO. And I read that. I contacted this person. I found them on social media. I explained who we were. I said, I'd like to speak to your mum and dad, if possible. She said, I'll ask them. And they said, yeah. And it was Mr. Jerry Blair and Mrs. Maria Blair. I phoned them up initially and spoke to them, and they said they'd seen the blue lights over the river, they'd seen something else. But it was at this point, and I'll pass over to Irina, I'd already published several of Irina's books. I just felt it was more appropriate to have someone in the States with an American accent rather than this strange chap from across the Atlantic phoning people out of the blue, getting the time zones wrong as well. So passed that on to Irina, and Irina began the investigations there. And she'll tell you the story of Mr. and Mrs. Blair. Irina.
Well, they were the first people I talked to. And he gave me their phone number, and the first person I talked to was Mr. Blair. And he said something about a big splash and a blimp, and then he gave the phone to his wife. And apparently he was some kind of a skeptic then. And so I talked to his wife, and she said that they were waiting for his supervisor to come. They were on the boat was at the end of the pier, and they were in a car at the other end of the pier waiting for his supervisor to come. This was before cell phones or anything, so they didn't know when he was coming. And so they were sitting there waiting. And so Jerry, the husband, went to sleep, and Maria was in the car, and she began to see this thing flying around, and she couldn't understand what it was. She thought it was an airplane. She kept looking at it, and it kept going through all these motions. It didn't go anywhere, and it just went around, and so she kept saying that it looked like the pilot was lost, and the pilot didn't know what he was doing, and why was the pilot flying around like that. And so finally Jerry decided to take his clothes to the ship. The supervisor still wasn't there, and so they had to walk down the pier to the ship. And Jerry was walking in front of her, in front of Maria. And Maria was walking down, and something flopped up on the pier right in front of her, and it looked like a person. She said that she couldn't understand it, and she said that it just looked like a person, and then it went back down, and she couldn't figure out why it did come out for breath. And she told Jerry, and Jerry just said, nothing, like it was a fish or something. And I asked her several times, is it a fish or a dolphin or, and she said it didn't come up for breath, and it looked just like a person. And so they walked on down the pier and got in the ship about 9 o'clock. And then about 12 o'clock, she was walking back to her car, and she was terrified. She ran down the pier and jumped in her car and left. And I could tell she was very, 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 had a lot of feelings about this thing that flopped up in front of her on the pier. And she also was very, very nervous about something. And so we talked and wrote back and forth for about 2 years. And I could just tell there was something real tense in her mind about it. And she had all these emotions, but she had no idea why she had the emotions, but she certainly had the emotions. And then later, her husband became ill and unfortunately died. But right before he went on a ventilator, which they put in your neck and you can't talk or anything, right before he went on that, he told her that they had been abducted, and he had kept all this from her all this time and acted like a skeptic. So he had contact with these aliens or whatever they were in previous times. And then he had made some kind of a pact with him to not hurt her. But he knew about him. He remembered being abducted and that sort of thing. And then it sort of slowly kind of came to her. And she said eventually, as things came to her, that this thing that flopped up on the pier in front of her, that it seemed to, when she remembered more about it, it seemed to get control of her mind. And that all she remembers just it flopped up on top of the pier, and then she didn't remember anything else. But she had all the emotions of whatever happened, but she just didn't know what was going on. And so then nobody hypnotized her to start with because her husband had just died. But her husband and both of them wanted to tell Philip that this was something he remembered. So she filmed him, and then they both called Philip and talked to him about it so that he can verify what they said. So so she didn't have.
Yeah. Mr. Blair was literally, Laurie, on his hospital bed, going to have an operation and wasn't sure if he was going to survive, and he insisted on speaking to me, and then made his wife, with the cell phone, film him. he did survive that, but it was only a temporary fix, if you like. You know, as Irina was saying, he eventually passed away. But even though he was ill, I mean, Irina confirms when he started to tell Maria what had happened, she gave him what for. She said, "You got some explaining to do, you know, big time." Because when I first spoke to Maria, she said to me then, you know, she wondered if something similar had happened to them, like happened to Charlie and Calvin. And I said, "Why do you think that?" She was very emotional about this. She had flashes, you know, little flashes of things. And I think once Jerry started explaining to her what had happened, then these flashes made sense. There were little glimpses of what had happened. And she wanted to undergo hypnosis, which we put her off for a while, but she asked again. So I managed to get a local hypnotherapist in the area who could do regressive hypnosis. And we did this last year, and it was at Calvin Parker's house. So she got to know Calvin by this time. He'd been under hypnosis before, so he could explain things to her. What we did with the hypnotherapist, Laurie, is not tell her anything. I mean, not a word. She had no idea what to expect. We just gave her a date, a time, and a location. She put Mrs. Blair under hypnosis. She recounted some of the details. She said these creatures were after our DNA and her eggs. They wanted to make children that could walk amongst us but wouldn't be recognized. And again, she was very emotional during the hypnosis and afterwards. I'll make of it what you will, you know, but, you know, the whole story of that is in our new book. I mean, every single word of it, the whole transcript of the hypnosis is there. And this is your original questions was about, you know, how difficult it's been. Well, it's been, I would say, a lot easier because, you know, we found this message on YouTube, you know, about my mum and dad being on the opposite side of the river. Now, that could never have happened in 1973 because there was no such thing. And both Irina and I have used social media to our best advantage at times when we've been trying to find others, you know. So there's another gentleman. I'll give an example. There's another gentleman we interviewed. He's called Mr. Lewis Lee. Sadly, no longer with us. He turned up at a book signing in Pascagoula that Calvin was doing, and he said, "Oh, can I buy a book, Mr. Parker? Thank you very much. Sign it." And as he's leaving, he said, "Oh, I saw the UFO that night," and off he went. So we'd no idea who he was, but somebody was taking photographs. So we have a picture of him buying the book. We put that on social media. Anybody know this gentleman? A young lady from a local institution contacted us and says, "Yeah, I know him. I'll ask him if you can speak to him." He said, "Yeah, give us the phone numbers." We interviewed Mr. Lee. He was actually, again, on the opposite side of the river that night, but he was working in the shipyard. He was a crane driver. And he said, "Philip, my cab's about 10 feet off the ground." He said, "As soon as I got in it, I could see this damn thing out across the river, you know?" And he explained it in full detail. So I just asked him, I said, did you tell anybody? Did you report it to anyone? He says, "Philip, this is 1973. You can't call Ghostbusters, you know." In other words, who do you call? Nobody. He said, "I told my family about it, and that's it." Whereas today, you know, we can pass information around the world in the blink of an eye almost, Laurie, you know? Yeah. So I think it made it, as you know, today's technology has made it a lot easier for us to find people and to look for others. You know, you'd see a posting on Facebook maybe, and somebody that all these comments, "Yes, I believe him. No, I don't. Yes, I do. No." Oh, and then you find one and said, "Oh, I saw that thing that night." You know, just a little comment. Contact that person and see if they'll speak to us, you know. So I think it's been a lot easier in a lot of respects.
Absolutely. Did you ever find, were there, through your investigation, Were there any sightings in that area before or after the event?
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, in the book, we put some sightings that occurred in the area just before and in and around the area as well, and afterwards. And what we did find is that there was a huge wave of sightings that year across the United States. And it seemed like October was the peak for whatever reason. Obviously, back in 1973, there was no idea of that. You know, we've got the benefit of hindsight now. And I'll give you another example, and I'll come to Irina in a second. About 3 weeks later, so it's November 6th, in the same stretch of water, but just a bit further out, there are 9 people in 3 little fishing boats, 3 little skiffs, fishing with their nets. And they spot something under the water. It is circular, it's about 30 feet in diameter. They said it was segmented, like the old Second World War parachutes were in segments.
Mm-hmm.
And they got so close, they could hit it with their oar, and it went clunk. The lights would then go out. It would appear somewhere else. Lights would come back on. So they played cat and mouse. Eventually, they went to the Coast Guard station, which was nearby, and reported it in person. Mm-hmm. And the Coast Guard sent a boat out, and they too saw it. And they too hit it with an oar, and it went clunk. Now, what we did, we managed to locate the actual Coast Guard documents about this incident in full, with no redactions, everybody's name. And we even have a letter from one of the Coast Guard crew, a handwritten letter that was sent to Leonard Stringfield, a UFO researcher in the past. Mm-hmm. And a colleague said, do you know they took a photograph of all these witnesses? And so has it. So I contacted so-and-so, and he says, yeah. What they did the next day, they lined all these civilian witnesses up on the quayside, took a colour photograph of them, and on the back was all their names. So again, put that on social media. Does anybody know any of these people? Can you get in touch with us? A lady got in touch, and she said, I know them all, but they're all deceased apart from one. And he was related to her in some way via marriage. And it was a name by one of them called Earl Ryan. Got his telephone number. And Irina, you interviewed Mr. Ryan, did you not?
Yes. He remembered it real well. In fact, he said that he told me that he could take me out right then and show me exactly where everything happened. And it wasn't very far from where the abduction was either. He was 16 years old at the time and with his father. And they were out in one of the boats, and they saw this thing, and they couldn't figure out what it is. I mean, it's not something you don't see something floating around lit up underwater. They were just fishing and doing the normal thing of net fishing and all that, and they couldn't figure out what it was. And they were poking around and stuff. And he said his father took an oar and hit it, and it sounded metallic. And so I asked him how he could do that. And he said they had an unusually long oar, so he did it. Well, so they would irritate it, and it would turn its lights off and go someplace else and appear again. And then the other people in the skiffs and everything came, and they looked at it, and nobody could figure out what it was. And so they decided to go to the authorities, and he and his father went to the Coast Guard station, and they got 2 Coast Guard officers to come. The Coast Guard officers came in a bigger boat and everything, and they found it too. And they did the same exploration. I mean, they would get close to it and bother it. It would turn its lights off, and it'd be someplace else, and they would go where it was. And sometimes it could turn its lights on really, really bright. But most of the time it was sort of dim, and they thought it was lit from underneath. And the Coast Guard people thought it was really weird. They'd never seen anything like it. And one of the Coast Guard people said that if you held an oar over its light, that the light just went right through it like an X-ray, and it didn't make a shadow or anything. And he thought the whole thing was strange, but the Coast Guard couldn't explain it either. No. And it floated around And eventually there was a channel in the river that was deeper than the rest of it. Eventually it went to this channel and left. And Earl told me that he thought it was guided and it knew where it was going. And it was familiar with the riverbank and everything. It was intelligent. It wasn't just something strange floating around, but nobody had any idea what it was or had seen anything like it.
Yeah, and in those documents that we mentioned, Laurie, that are from the Coast Guard, it's their report on it. They say in no uncertain terms it remained unidentified. They had no idea what this thing was. And that's all in the book. You know, there's Earl Ryan's interview with Irina, plus all the documents. Again, nothing redacted. Everything is there, and you know, people can draw their own conclusions from it.
This is really, really a phenomenal story. I mean, to have all these documents and when you look at people going before say a judge, and is some of it circumstantial evidence, but when the evidence echoes itself, that to the point that you've got so many other people, witnesses, and you can't ignore it or disregard it.
Well, that's where we got the title of the book. I mean, we originally we had a working.
There you go, beyond and beyond. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a working title, and it didn't quite catch, but we had to call it something. And then I was watching a courtroom drama one night, and they said, "Well, we have to prove beyond reasonable doubt." And I went, "Oh, bingo!" And I emailed Irene and I said, "What do you think about this?" And she said, "Yeah, I like that." So that's that. And we're not out to indoctrinate anybody, Laurie, or say this is proof of this, that, or the other. What we say in the book is that here is all our evidence that we've amassed. We haven't left anything out, and we're confident if we could take all of this evidence to a courtroom, we could prove that something really extraordinary happened. We're not saying it was an alien abduction. We're saying something really, really extraordinary took place that night and around that time, not just on that night. And if anyone is a jury, then it is the readers of the book, not myself and Irina. It's those that read the book. They can draw their own conclusions.
That's incredible. I'm just reading over my own notes here, and let me see here.
Well, what I will say, Laurie, is that even though the book is published, the investigations haven't stopped. Literally, I think just 2 weeks ago, we had a gentleman contact us. He doesn't want to use his real name, although we have it. Mm-hmm. And he too was driving over the motorway bridge. You call it a highway, we call it a motorway here in the UK. He was driving over the bridge that goes over the river. And as he's coming off the bridge, he sees this thing in the sky, and he says, "I don't know what it was, but I know what it wasn't. It wasn't an airplane or a helicopter." So even though we've written the book, and there were several times we said we'd finished it, but then something else would crop up. So Irina would be sent interviewing somebody else, so we have to edit it again. But we finally drew a line in the sand and said, that is it. But it still continues. And just last week, I contacted the archives of a well-known researcher of this subject in the 90s. I won't say who at the moment, but if I did, everybody would know who it was. And just a blanket question. Is there anything in the archive related to the Pascagoula case of 1973? I got a response and said, we have a 2-page letter from a person who wrote to this researcher detailing what happened to them in that area in 1973. Mm-hmm. Now, this letter wasn't written until the 1990s, but it was telling of something that happened back in 1973. So just on the off chance that this person is still alive, maybe living at the same address, because their name and address is on the letter. It's not, nothing's redacted. We have written, we've done it the old-fashioned way. We've sent a letter in the post to say, here's a copy of your letter, could you tell us more, please? So more and more information is still coming in, and I know there's other people out there that have seen things or maybe have a few documents, and we're hoping that with it being the anniversary, with it being our book coming out, it might entice them to come forward.
Oh, absolutely. Have you noticed any patterns or similarities with some of the stories that are coming out in, say, regard to even um, the ones that learned that they were abducted, that
Well, one of the common denominators, although it's not across the board, but one of the common denominators is these blue lights. The blue lights that Charlie and Calvin first saw. Mr. and Mrs. Blair on the opposite side of the river saw this blue thing flying up and down erratically. Mr. Lee and his, in the working in the shipyard, said it was like a bluey white diamond. We have another gentleman called Charles Rusty Anderson. He too was driving over the highway bridge that night. He saw this thing down below him. He said, I thought it was so low, I thought it was going to crash. And of course, where he's looking is where Charlie and Calvin were fishing. And of course, it was blue colored.
No.
So that's not with everyone, but there is that little bit of a common denominator amongst it. And for example, Irina and I have been involved in making a new documentary with a British company. They were out in the States last year filming. They interviewed Mr. Anderson, and he put a little post on Facebook saying, I've been interviewed for this documentary. One of the comments underneath was from a lady with a completely different name to Mr. Anderson's, I might add. She said, oh, I saw that thing that night. So I contacted her. Would you speak to us? Oh, of course. She's called Pamela Riley Eves. She was putting her children to bed that night. Went to close the curtains. You can see this blue thing. What we found out is Mrs. Eves is actually the cousin of Mr. Anderson.
Oh, wow.
And neither of them knew about the other's sighting. So even within the family units, it wasn't necessarily the hot topic of conversation. And she's interviewed. We have a photograph of her, and Irina spoke to her. She's in the book, along with Mr. Anderson, her cousin.
Well, I think if anyone is interested in ufology or anything related to abduction, UFO abductions, or I think this is the go-to book. I truly do. And definitely going to be part of my library. I actually tried to order the book. It was kind of strange on Amazon. It said you could only get it through Kindle, and you had to order Audible. So I'm thinking, I'll figure it out. I'll figure out how to get a copy of this book.
No. Irina and I discussed this. We are aware of the current economic climate in different parts of the world. So the book is available in a whole host of different formats. For example, there is a very large hardback edition, and that's the most expensive. Then we have a 10x8 and a 6x9 paperback. The 6x9 is by the cheapest, of course. And then we have it on Kindle and audiobook as well. So we're hoping that there's something for everyone's wallet in amongst that. But it's there, I can assure you.
Yes.
I know it is because I bought copies myself.
So when is your documentary coming out?
We're not sure. We know Irina's been interviewed, as have I. I have a list here on my filing cabinet of all the witnesses that were interviewed. There's about 13 witnesses interviewed. How many of them make it into the final documentary is not up to us. We're not making it, but it is done. It's in the editing stage, and we're hoping it'll be out before the end of the year. But again, that's not anything we have any say over. But I know that the film crew were very well received. Calvin was interviewed at length along with his wife Waynette, and Calvin was, very ill at the time. but he still managed to do the interview. And it will probably be one of the last he ever did, I believe. And it's quite poignant. I'll say no more than that. I've seen a couple of little clips of it, and we're looking forward to it, and, I can't say any more than that, really.
Well, like I said, I look forward to seeing that too. I mean, there's a lot of information out there, and I so appreciate you, Philip, being in the business of working with authors, and you being an author yourself, and Irina, being authors willing to go out and do all this research. It's just really important to so many people putting this puzzle together. All these little pieces are so invaluable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel honored to work with somebody like Dr. Scott. We've laughed about this. I'm a son of a coal miner. I've got no formal education whatsoever. And if somebody was said to me when I was a teenage boy, "Oh, you'll write a book with a doctor in the future," I would have laughed at them. I said, "You're nuts, no way." But I'm not being big-headed or anything like that. I think we've worked very well together. And when we've been interviewing these people, I think, Irina, how many people have you interviewed in total? I forget now.
I need to count them. I think maybe 20 or something, but I'm not sure. I need to go through and count them. I haven't done it yet.
Yeah. Well, somebody asked me, Laurie, how many witnesses there were in the book. When they asked me, I honestly didn't know. So I literally got the book out and went through it. And there's 40 plus witnesses in this book, literally. Some, were there in 1973 and were interviewed. Some in the interviewing years that were interviewed, and we've been able to access that information. But the vast majority of them over these last few years. So, and whilst I may have made the initial contact, it's been Irina that's done the vast majority of the interviews, and they're still coming. They are still coming.
Well, that's so important. Like, it's also important for people for cathartic reasons. I mean, when you see something, when you like the woman you mentioned about who went under the hypnosis. She did go through the hypnosis, and she did learn that.
Oh, absolutely. And it's like with Calvin. I mean, he carried this trauma around with him for decades.
Yeah.
And of course, when other people started coming out of the woodwork and said, "Hang on a minute, we saw it that night as well." And then you have Jerry and Maria Blair say, "We had a similar experience." He felt vindicated. It was almost like "I told you so" moment. Why wouldn't you listen to us back in 1973? The sheriff told everybody we weren't lying. Dr. Hynek said we weren't lying, but he wouldn't listen to us then. But yeah, so there you go. I told you so. And you could see the weight being lifted off Calvin's shoulders, literally. And it was a great day. When he found out these people were there.
And it's wonderful that it took till 2018 when he decided to put his words down on paper and share them with the world. I mean, he left a huge legacy just by doing that.
Well, that's what he wanted to do. It's funny you should mention that, Laurie, because Calvin used that word, and he said, "I want to leave a legacy." And I said, "What's the legacy, Calvin?" So "I want to leave people my story." He said, when you and me are dead and gone, Philip, with today's technology, future generations will be able to, carry on and find out what happened to us. It won't just be buried on a dusty old bookshelf somewhere. In today's digital technology, you can't erase anything. It is there. And he wanted to leave that legacy. And I said, "Well, look, and I spoke to him literally the week before he died. I got him on the phone, and I said, even though you're on your way to somewhere else, Irina and I will be the torchbearers for you, and we will continue looking for the information, and we'll publish it in whatever way we can." And he was extremely grateful to know that. And we will, as simple as that.
It's nice to know that there are people like yourselves that are watching out for the backs of the experiencers out there. And I just, and I'm thinking in terms of my own self being an experiencer. And, it's just really so important, especially when all that time, especially 1973, almost 50 years ago, when he had sighting that, who would believe him, a young, 19, 18-year-old?
He was 18, he was 19 just a few weeks later in November of 1973. So I'm kind of from the same era, because I finished high school in 1974. So I'm 65. Calvin was only 3 or 4 years older than me. So I'm the same generation.
I'm right behind you. I'm 64. So yeah.
But it's like Irina. She's in her 40s now, so she won't remember this era.
Yeah. Oh, I thought no, she's 29. Yeah, you're right. She won't remember. Yeah, the historical factor of it all. And it's just been a privilege to really get to sit and talk to you. And I hope we can do this again, because I got a lot more topics to talk about.
Okay. Well, what we might do, of course, when the documentary comes out, and you may be able to view it, we may be able to come back to you and say, here you go, have a look at this, and then we could, because I don't know what's going to be on it until I see it,
Yeah.
So
well,
the only
absolutely. Now, if anyone out there is listening to this podcast, you have got to go on Amazon or just Google it. Beyond a Reasonable Doubt, the Pascagoula, is that right now? All this knows Pascagoula Alien Abduction. It's
thank you. I mean, all I would say is, if you're only going to buy one UFO book this year, then maybe ours might be the one. This might be the one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again.
Oh, thank you, Laurie.
Thank you.
And I hope I will get this up very, very quickly. I'm good about that part. And you guys rock. Thank you again.
Okay, and good night. Thank you.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.